Excellent, thank you. So let's pull this all up. Yeah, first of all, thanks to everybody that's been presenting so far today. There's been a lot of great stuff discussed. I'm sad to say this will probably be the least interesting of the presentations you'll hear in this session. But I certainly appreciate Monty reaching out and asking to have a discussion or have me participate in this. And, you know, my perspective on this here, or my discussion is going to just kind of be focused on, you know, what works in the CRM context. I guess I'm going to have to do this without notes, so this will be fun. So, you know, the talk I'm going to give here, discussion I want to have, is really just kind of about the communication aspects from the culture resource management side. And, you know, a lot of this might be kind of tongue in cheek, as you can see from my graphic here. You know, there's oftentimes folks in a room talking about different things. They think they might be talking about the same thing, but they're actually talking about different things, or they don't know how to talk to each other about the subject. So just a little quick background about me, who I am. I am a culture resource management applied anthropologist. I've been working in Alaska for upwards of just near 20 years now. I got a master's degree from the University of Alaska in Anchorage in 2013 in anthropology, and I specialized in culture resource management during that time. I've worked pretty extensively all across the state doing field work in anthropological and archaeological and historic contexts. Just to go back to Monty's earlier discussion, just to clarify what I mean by that is I've done work, you know, that involved interviewing individuals and members of communities in rural Alaska. I've done field work that involves searching for subsurface material remains from what Monty had settled on at this time as ancestral sites or ancestral occupations, and then also done work on historic facilities or historic sites and places across the state of Alaska, military installations and things like that. I've also done, in a past life, I've also done some environmental science work, munitions response, that's taken me to some pretty remote places in the state. So the framework of what I want to talk with is just about, you know, some rough, you know, who in a CRM context, from a consultant's perspective, who are we trying to talk to? Who are we talking with? And how are we doing that communication? How are we having those conversations? How are we having those events to relay and share information? And what exactly are we talking about in those discussions or in those communications? Because sometimes that's the biggest barrier. Folks aren't really sure what they're talking about. They may think they're talking about something, but they might not be conveying that correctly to the other parties. And then lastly, you know, what are some of the challenges that come out of that, you know, from trying to have these kinds of cross-cultural dialogues? What are some of the issues that arise with that? So in terms of who are we talking to, the parties in the process are usually, you know, most well known to most folks probably on this phone call. You have your federal and state agencies. Apologies for the Zoom silliness on my end. If anybody can, if those things are popping up to everybody else, I apologize for that. So you have your state and your federal agencies. These are the folks that are, you know, in some way authorizing, funding, or regulating, you know, a process that we're in. You have your Indian tribes, and I have an asterisk here because depending on the context that you're working in, this can mean more or less. And the discussion that I'm having today, or in the context that I'm using it today, is how it was recently reaffirmed by the Supreme Court relating to the CARES Act. So Indian tribes in most federal consultations include federally recognized tribes, but also regional and village ANCSA corporations. They are considered Indian tribes under those regulations. They need to be consulted with and involved in the communications and the consultation, just the same as a federally recognized Indian tribe or a native village. Local governments are often involved in consultations and should be involved in consultations. Sometimes they have permitting authority or regulatory authority on the work that's being conducted within the community. And this applies both to archaeological field work, but also for ethnographic field work. I know of at least one community that has a resolution on how the ethnographic data is collected within their community. Other parties that you're involved in could be non-governmental organizations, NGOs, things like local historical societies, museums, advocacy groups. The Russian Diocese of Alaska is consulted often if there's a Russian Orthodox property or cultural resource that's being potentially affected or involved in some way. And then lastly, the individual or entity which is seeking whatever kind of approval or authorization, which might be part of the process. So now that we've talked about, some of the folks that are part of that discussion, how do you go about having these things? And, again, there's myriad ways to involve and communicate with people. And a lot of it depends on the regulatory process you might be in. The most formal of these things tend to be, your what folks would call the Section 106 consultation meetings, which are can be, multi-participant events, or they can be one-on-one. The government to government or G to G meetings, these tend to be more narrow focused, certainly between a tribal government and a branch of the federal government in a direct government to government discussion. Informal conversations and discussions with members of these communities and entities that you're working with. Some projects we work on have dedicated outreach programs where they're specifically targeted at getting word out about a project, seeking input or seeking collaboration with communities. Likewise, public communications, things like public notices, social media posts, getting the word out via radio. I mean, there's all these different ways to get communication networks flowing. And the difference between some of these is, thinking about, are they one-way or two-way communications? Which ones are the ones where you're going to have a dialogue versus which one is more passive receptive type of discussion. I saw Gerad's heading on his title, and he kind of stole my thunder on here from the old Shakespearean quote there from Romeo and Juliet, but by other names. So what are we talking about in the discussions in cultural resource management, right? There's all these things that have been brought up in some of the discussions today. There's sites, there's historic properties, there's sacred places, cultural landscapes, ethnogeographic toponyms. That's one that I heard several years ago that I've always kind of held on to, which my understanding of it is that it's essentially talking about indigenous place names, but the way you convey that information, and I'll talk about this a little bit here, how you present information, but different ways you can call different things and the different meanings that might be attached to those historic sites. We talked about the site concept and what does that actually mean in a discussion with folks. TCPs, that's another big one that comes in. That's generally the first and last on this list are generally related to the Section 106 process, but sometimes these things get bantied around in non culture, non-106 contexts that can be a barrier and kind of confuse the discussions and the conversations. So what are some of the challenges in again, doing this cross-cultural type of communication? From my experience, a lot of it can come down to epistemologies and ways of knowing things. You know, Western scientific thought is vastly different and can be at times at odds with TK, traditional knowledge, and all that in a cultural resource management perspective sometimes needs to be filtered through concepts of project management, and that leads into some of the other topics here. But you know, how have things been done in the past? Preconceived notions or previous experiences of individuals. Well, it worked when we did it this way 5 years ago. Why can't we do it the same way now? Well, you know, our world is always kind of changing, and things are developing, things are progressing, things are moving in different directions. So what worked in the past may not always be a solid and concrete guide for how things can or should proceed in the future. Conveying those kinds of concepts can be difficult. Schedules and budgets. Again, the world in which cultural resource management is practiced is largely driven by dollars and time. And sometimes that is at direct odds with how communities and individuals conceive of and discuss properties of cultural significance and cultural importance to them. And balancing that need for meaningful discussion and meaningful communication against something that is driven by dollars and Microsoft project schedules and things like that can be a real delicate balance and take some pretty creative thinking at times. I go back to one of the earlier things I ever learned from Tom King, the CRM, kind of guru during my time at UAA, and it's determining what are people's interests and not focus so much on what their positions are, especially when you get in contentious situations. It's not so much about people telling you and communicating to each other what their interests are. It's they're staking their ground. They're drawing their lines in the sand, and they're saying, here's where we're firm. Here's where we're going to stay. And that really doesn't foster meaningful communication and compromise. But talking about interests can. What are the goals that you have? What are some of your primary interests in the outcome of this process? And you can build from those things rather than work from defending positions. Litigation is another challenge when the threat of pending lawsuits or ongoing lawsuits that are in place that can really cause clients and agencies and everybody else to kind of clam up and not want to talk, or to do that kind of communicating in a very guarded way. And sometimes that can really have an impact on what kind of information, what kind of emotions are being conveyed in a discussion. Jargon, that's another big challenge for those of us trying to, again, do the kind of cross-cultural communication. I think back to a personal experience as I was pulling all this together. I was in a consultation meeting for a controversial project, and at that time I had been working on a GIS-based model of coastal archaeological site potential that factored in coastal geomorphology and the recorded locations of modern marine resource concentrations. And I was asked to explain how we came up with that model and what the results were. And I went into it using all of the language of GIS and archaeology and everything. And a tribal representative from Cukotka stood up and said, "Well, that's all great, but say that in English now." So in my mind, I had explained exactly the steps I took and the methods I used to classify areas on a landscape, but I did it in a way that wasn't intelligible or wasn't approachable to somebody that wasn't a GIS practitioner, GIS expert. So, keeping things intelligible, keeping things clear and concise. And then too little or too much. Again, just drawing on personal recent experience. There's times where you want to put together all the pieces and show everybody everything you did and all your work. But maybe in doing so, you've kind of buried some of the more salient points of that work. We just worked with a project to produce a very large and detailed 1,300 pages of data from a field season. And some of the initial feedback we've gotten on that is that it's too much. we provided too much, and part of it is that we were working under certain requirements that things need to be included in certain submittals, but again, it's that fine line, that balancing act. So I'm running up on the end here, and I'll kind of wrap it up with some of my closing thoughts here. I've realized I'll never be good at communicating as an individual, but that doesn't mean I need to stop trying. I should always be working on getting better at it. And I think this goes back to, some of the stuff our other presenters have talked about. Gerad talked about language is always changing. Words and signifiers are always changing. And that would lead to the idea that, well, then our communication always needs to be changing. We need to be adapting and keep developing and keep working on those things. The concept that was recently introduced to me, other folks might know it, but the idea of the platinum rule. It's always kind of grown up with the golden rule, right? Treat others as you want to be treated. Well, that doesn't really work so great if you're not the same, you don't have the same experiences, or you have differing perspectives. So the platinum rule instead is, treat people how they want to be treated. And how do you know how people want to be treated? Is you ask, how would you like to communicate? What's the most effective way for us to communicate with you about subject X? Or what's the most effective way for us to meet, or things like that. So again, it's still applying those same concepts of mutual respect, but it's recognizing that we're different, and we may have different ways of communicating and preferring to be communicated with. One of the biggest challenges I often face is determining wants and needs. Most agencies or clients that I interact with, they have a pretty good idea in their head of what they think they need. And oftentimes some of the hardest conversations are really driving down to what do they actually need? What you think you might need. Again, it could be influenced by some of those things we talked about before, preconceived notions or past experience. Well, we did it this way in 2005. Well, it's 2022 now. Things change, things are different. But what happened in those past situations and instances may not hold true anymore. I often focus on or think about, consider, who am I? What do I do? Who do I owe? What do I owe? And to whom? And, as a role as an applied anthropologist and a consultant, I've had some discussions with colleagues in the past about, am I supposed to be a yes man? Am I telling individuals or entities what they want to hear? Or am I providing them with the totality of my experience and understanding of the cultural context, the regional demographics, the experiences that I've collected over the years, and try and give them the best possible suite of information for which they can then essentially do with what they will. That's a concept I'm still working on. So, and lastly, I'll just close with saying that, I think there have been some changes, particularly at the highest levels of government, that are giving me a great cause for optimism, because as I've worked through this process over the years, one of the resounding themes I seem to hear most often is that it doesn't seem to be working anymore. The 106 process in general seems to not be doing its job, and I have some optimism that particularly the changes at the Department of the Interior are going to have an influence on that in a positive respect. So with that, I'll conclude, and again, apologies for the Zoom screen messiness if that was coming through on everybody else's end.
It was not, Jake. Wonderful presentation.
Oh,
thank you as always. So up next, and the last presentation for our session is the other co-host of this session, Corey, and he'll be chatting about his experiences, and then afterwards, once again, we'll have a open discussion, and it's not on the schedule, but we'll do it anyways. So, all right, Corey, it's all yours.
Thank you, Monty, and thank you, other presenters. This is a real honor to be here. Just to remind you, Monty, too, I had been letting people in just to keep an eye on that in the waiting room. My name is Corey Sikuaq Erickson, and I will begin sharing my screen. So this last presentation that I'll be presenting is just kind of my own experience involving the concept of prehistory, and kind of how I grew up learning about our own cultural and family history, and then kind of going to college and becoming an anthropologist and learning about the concept of prehistory. And I was like, okay, my history is actually called prehistory, and then coming full circle and realizing, well, actually, no, our history is our history. So that's why I kind of framed it this way. And I'll be kind of hoping to wrap things up for the session, and I might not go the full 20 minutes, so it might give us a little bit extra time for the roundtable. And a huge thank you to the previous speakers, especially very quickly, Monty, for laying out the conversation, introducing us to these topics, Hannah, Shina, and Melissa, as well as Justin and Jillian. Really great initiatives. Thank you for sharing those. I'm always really amazed, especially at Melissa's work, but the National Park Service too is doing really good things up there in the Northwest. Gerad, that was really interesting, deeper look at the context and the history of some of these terms. And Sveta and Igor, thank you very much for sharing about the terms regarding food and I'm always really interested in the food security conversation, so maybe I'll reach out to you after, Sveta, and especially in these trying times right now. I know how I can't imagine how worrisome it is for you right now to have family going through, and we're all praying and keeping people in Ukraine in our thoughts and prayers. And then Jake, thank you for really laying out more of the details of the processes. And I know you have tons of experiences in this field, so that was really helpful to learn about. My name is Corey Sikuaq Erickson. I grew up in Unalakleet, Savunga, and St. Michael's. I have a lot of family in Shishmaref area, as well as Barrow. And really happy to see a lot of friends and colleagues on the call today, and a lot of mentors as well. Focus of this presentation, and I just wanted to prove to you guys that yes, I did grow up in the village, as you can see, with one of our main staples, Dr. Pepper. So the focus of this presentation, just a quick disclaimer, just let folks know, although I identify as a native anthropologist, I've been kind of out of the field of anthropology and archaeology for several years. I've been working as a liaison in climate sciences. So I could probably think of a lot of things to talk about in relating climate sciences with anthropology, the anthropology world, but I have really been working with the physical and geophysical sciences, helping climate scientists interact and engage with villages. That's been my primary job for the last 7 years. So I'm really utilizing a lot of the stuff I learned in anthropology. However, I've been out of touch with a lot of the field. So I apologize if some of my reflections on my experiences in anthropology are maybe dated a little bit. Maybe things have progressed in a better direction. And I also recognize that I'm just basically providing personal reflections of the experiences, not necessarily typical anthropological evidence, but I also recognize that many of the other presentations today were also very reflective. Just to remind you that this discussion of prehistory, the basis of my presentation is really about identity, really finding out who I was growing up, kind of. As you can see, the complexion of me and my brothers, I have 4 brothers, but you can see that we're very light-skinned. My mom is mixed, also at Newpack, as well as down south, Comanche, and also some Euro-American, and my dad is Norwegian. So early life, while I was growing up, in that context, I was constantly kind of trying to figure out who I was, who our family was, and where we kind of came from, because growing up, especially in St. Michael's, for instance, that's a Yupik village, and my mom's being all the way from Barrow, being a very light-skinned complexion. You get that, you can see the picture of me and 2 of my brothers right there in the middle. And then some of my best friends, Derek, and our best friends, and Tony and Gunnar, growing up. This is in Unalakleet. But we all experience bullying, kind of that stuff growing up. It's part of life. One big thing that I experienced, especially specifically, was just being very light-skinned. We got a lot of the gusuk derogatory kind of being called a white boy, or like all the. And then even I remember as early as kindergarten, first grade, I remember fellow classmate just like saying, "You and all the other white people got to get the F off of our land," sort of thing. So we started experiencing these things very early on. And then we'd go home sad or whatever, and my mom would straighten us up. "You're a Newpack, you're tough, you eat more muktuk than that person that said that," or something like that. So like she'd always instill that real pride. So from the very early on, we were being instilled with that identity, that our people, that we were a Newpack, and that we were from the just around for a long time. My mom would always tell us that we were, really instilled that native pride. And then also we were very lucky to have on my dad's side as well. He always reminded us of our Norwegian heritage. We always celebrated 17th of May, 17th of May, the Constitution Day. We always had all kinds of Norwegian stuff everywhere. So we are very proud of that side of our family as well, that history. However, the Indigenous side and the history and how far people go back, none of that was actually taught when I went through school, and I graduated high school in 2003. And in Unalakleet, we moved to Unalakleet when I was going to the 5th grade from St. Michael. We actually went to Unalakleet when I was a kid, out to Sivunga for a couple of years. My dad taught out there, and then over to St. Michael's for 6 years. And then 5th, 6th grade, we moved back over to Unalakleet, and that's where I spent until I went to college. And in the school system, we didn't learn about our history. The Alaska history section, I know that there's been a lot of talk about curriculum, and in the last 10, 15 years, things have been hopefully changing for the better. I'm not too sure if it has, but I will say that I didn't learn about how the depth of our history from school. I learned about it from fellow friends, from fellow family members, from my mom and them, from other hunters, and then just being surrounded by just immense archaeological, quote unquote, I'm referring to them archaeological sites now, just because ancestral sites, we just call them old sites. It's a pastime for a lot of people to do the digging and stuff. And that's actually, I had a whole other part of this that I wanted to talk about other terms, but I realized that I should probably just focus on this concept of prehistory in this presentation, because I also wanted to talk about like elder and a few other terms that are kind of questionable on capitalizing and used. But in this presentation, I'm just really focused on how I learned about the concept of prehistory and how I really struggled with it. I don't ever recall learning about it when I was growing up. Basically, when you're a kid, you're pretty much taught, our people have been here forever, or, time immemorial. I remember here now, or 10,000 years is a very popular thing to say, as we all know. We hear about that a lot. People have been here for 10,000 years, kind of thing. So that's kind of what I remember growing up, is that, and there was no reason for me to question it. We had old sites surrounding us everywhere. And, archaeological remains and stuff scattered about on the beaches. We always heard a lot of spooky stories about the burials, to stay away from the burials, sort of. So that was one reason why we always usually just left things, because there's so many burials and we didn't ever want to touch any of the belongings of the person who was buried. So, and I apologize if I didn't give credit to who took this picture, but I had it on my computer from a long time ago when I was fortunate enough to go to Cape Espenberg on that project for a couple summers. That was a really, really fun and good learning experience I had out there. But the point is that when I went to college, I still had that kind of mindset that, our people have been here forever. That's our history. Our history goes way, way back. I had never heard of the term prehistory. However, when as we all know, that when we're in that stage of life, we're really trying to figure out who we are and where we come from. And being a mixed heritage student, Native and Norwegian, coming from the village, the culture shock of moving to a city, Fairbanks, for a year was pretty big too. So there's that's a big transition that I was going through, but at the same time, I was part of a big cohort of kind of Native kids that were trying to learn about who we were and where we came from. At that point, I was really seeking out any type of information that I could learn about our culture, because I had never learned about it in growing up, like I said, in the schools. So what I did was I started gravitating towards those types of classes when I was doing my prerequisites, and I took anthropology as well as a lot of the Alaska Native Studies courses when I moved down to Anchorage. I actually took everything that they offered in Alaska Native Studies, and if they would have had a major offered, it probably would have had a double major with anthropology and Native Studies. However, I got the minor in Alaska Native Studies. But I was totally drawn to anthropology, especially by the late Dr. Phyllis Fast, who took me under her wing and really taught me that I could actually use my education, everything in my education, even outside of anthropology, to learn more about ourselves, our history, our people in Alaska, my own history. I really tried to learn about the history of our regions. And I spent all of those years in all of those classes really trying to gear every single project. I try to fill in a little blank spot of what I understood of the history. So that's what really drew me to anthropology, and archaeology, is that I really want to learn about myself, our culture and everything. However, when I was introduced to the concept of prehistory, I remember it being kind of taught as just kind of a given. And I'm not saying that people totally endorse this, backed it up. If we would have got into an argument about it, it was just kind of just something taken for granted, just kind of a given. It's like, that's just the way it is. That's how we refer to it, no one specifically in my studies or anything, I wouldn't blame them for using this or anything. It's kind of a huge framework that, none of us in Alaska created. And who knows, it might be such a big thing that not one of us alone can change this either, so but I think we all could take steps towards moving to addressing this issue here. And I know that it's been talked about a lot in the academic publications. I didn't do my due diligence on reading up on all of the discussions that criticizing the words prehistory and history, but I know that there's a lot of narratives out there about it. So what the point on this slide was that, those first years of college and getting into anthropology, I was just really learning about our own history. And it, really gave a huge sense of pride. But then that being told that, okay, well, since the non-natives came, prehistory is anything before the written or when we came is prehistory. And that really didn't sit well with me. And I'm sorry, James, maybe I will let you, do you have a question, James, or a comment? I'd love to hear. Dr. Carey?
Well, I was gonna comment a little later in the discussion, but I just put that hand raise thing out there. Well, I hope I'm not cutting you short there, but this is an interesting session that I think could not happen in an in-person conference. And I've been kind of dubious about Zoom presentations. Like last year when I tried to give a poster, it was a smash flop. And nobody, everybody was over at Gerad's poster and nobody looked at mine and nobody'd seen it. So I decided this Friday to give a poster, or I'm making a poster available, but it's during a 20-minute talk because I couldn't possibly cover the breadth of things that are in the poster in 20 minutes. At the same time, making the poster is useful because it helps me introduce what I'm introducing, which is the Lower Tanana Dictionary. But some of the earlier talks on place names and ethnogeography, I like to define them very rigorously. And we use, I'm real impressed with how Dena'ina names are used throughout Anchorage and Kenai and Cook Inlet Basin on signs. And in some, but what I maintain, and Gerad is the GIS person on it, is a Dene, adjacent Dene language place names database with about 12,500 features, many of which have multilingual variants. So I say that the ethnogeography, if it's grouped by drainage, it can be cumulative, and we have dictionary files that create an editorial standard. And so that has happened over the years. Actually, 2022 is the 50th year I've been doing work in Alaska, but I started my work as early as the fall of 1968 when I read Sapir's Language. And Edward Sapir wrote a paper called, in 1916, Linguistic Time Perspective in Aboriginal North America. I wonder how many of you on the call have read that. And time.
Hey, Dr. Kaare, this is Monty here. I'm going to interrupt here quick. We only got a few minutes left of
Okay, that's all. That's good
presentation.
enough. I recommend reading Sapir 1916.
All right.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kaare. And I was actually looking for my Shim Pete's book. I was going to say, there's so many people on this call, and especially you, that have done amazing work, and I really appreciate your comment and you being here as well. And looking forward to learn more about the place name work that you have been doing currently. So picking back up where I left off at, I had grown up learning about our history kind of through the community, not through the school system, but really the depth of our history as being just kind of just forever out there, not learning about this concept of kind of prehistory. And then went to college and then kind of bumped into this concept of prehistory. And it even though it's kind of, it was taught to me as like, well, this is an anthropology, that's just kind of how we refer to it, as if you, but to me it really meant, like if, one of the meanings of history, that a whole series of past events connected to someone or something history, and then obviously before that. So kind of, to me, it felt like it was detaching my own identity and my own history away from this extensive evidence that our people have been here for so long. And to us, that's not, we didn't need any evidence. We don't even call it evidence. We already just know it, that we've been here for so long. And so like, it almost felt like I was being detached to the point where, I won't say it, a specific example, but it was at a time when I was as a student on working on a project that was near where one of my grandparents was born in a sod house, but for instance, and this discussion came up where I was kind of saying around the dinner table, so to speak, out in the field, where I said that, you know, this work that we're doing, what we're looking at, even if it's just a few hundred years old or 500 or 1,000 or whatever it is, like I really consider that our family history, like our history, you know, my history. And then I got kind of into a little bit of an argument with someone way up on the scale of power there, a very senior person, you know, and I don't mean to, but you know that they kind of corrected me and said, well, it is prehistory, you know, it is not in written, you know, pretty much told me that, you know, it is prehistory, unfortunately, regardless if you feel like it's history. And, you know, getting down to the semantics, that really stuck with me for almost 20 years now, where it really bothered me pretty deeply. And I didn't maybe tell them how much it bothered me, but it really, I remember that experience specifically. And I don't think people really at that time really realized how much it really was bothering, because there were just a few Native people there, all students, and being kind of told that, like, it's really felt like it was separating myself away from that site that we were working on, because I felt the direct connection, like you know, my grandparents was just born right here, you know, like right next to it, sort of thing. So that I just remember that experience happening, and I just wanted to let folks know that, you know, as anthropologists, as writers of history, just to be cognizant that when you have students, especially Native students, it's such a huge thing to be, for our own identity, for our own history, for our own well-being, and also just it really made me feel more whole and everything, learning about our history through archaeology. And it just really gave me a bad feeling in my stomach for a long time when I had that experience. And I know that that person was probably on the very farther end of the spectrum as far as cultural sensitivity. And I know that you know, everybody that I've 99% of everybody that I worked with is very sensitive towards this topic in anthropology. So I'm really appreciative of that. But just those kind of experiences might I just don't want it to hurt you know, especially Native anthropologists and people trying to find out who they are and using the field of anthropology and archaeology to learn about ourselves. Just to keep that in mind. I just wanted to just very quickly conclude that, you know, I did feel pretty uncomfortable sharing with this, because I, you know, in the field of working with climate sciences, there's so much stuff going on, and, you know, I work in so many heated spaces that, you know, I'm always trying to focus on the positive and building people up and helping to encourage people rather than shame. And so that's not what I'm trying to do here. And you know, I hope that this presentation moves us towards more mutual understanding of these types of things, potentially towards major changes, hopefully. Remember that time flies. If you're working on an archaeological site from a few hundred years ago, that's my Amau's Amau, pretty much. You know, that's how local people, you know, Amau means great grandparent. So, like, you know, just time flies, you know, and then, you know, we do have real connection to these sites. We really think that these sites are a representation of our history, and it's absolutely not a prehistory to us. So please be considerate of this. And I also want to emphasize that I recognize that nobody in this room created this framework, and but altogether, I think even if it's just within Alaska, we have the power to start really changing it. And I know that many of you guys have worked it towards changing this, and I really appreciated of that. Especially thank you for sharing, Dr. Kaare. Really respect so many of you guys' work out there. That's about it.
Well, thank you, everyone. That is the last presentation for our session. And so now we got now we're welcome to kind of open the discussion. We got time where it's not on the schedule, and so folks in the audience had any points they would like to bring up or ask any of the presenters, now's a great time. We got room. Just raise your hand, and Corey, I'll see if we can find you and open it up. Well, all right. Wow, the discussion is forthcoming. I want to point out just a couple of things that were brought up today, kind of reoccurring, is that language is not static, and that things change with the times, and that's okay. I said, and something I found in my research, my presentation, is that a lot of the things we, especially in CRM, a lot of the National Register bulletins were published before the 1992 amendment that emphasizes Indigenous significance to places. And and unfortunately, the updated bulletins carry on a lot of this out language that didn't take into account that areas of significance. So it's interesting just looking at the origins of our language and the words we use and where they come from and their context. Hannah, I see you got your hand up. Go ahead and jump on in.
Yeah, the hand up makes it look like it's like an immediate thing, but I mean, I'm enjoying, hearing you reflect on this. I raised my hand because I heard so many connections between the presentations and yours, starting with questioning the term prehistory. And then I heard, Corey and Melissa both share that has been like harmful to them. And I just want to give more space for that reaction to what you opened up about questioning that term. And then if there's any more that people want to share on it. Melissa didn't get much time because we had so many presenters during our conversation. So just I thought that would be a good thing to just shoot to the top of the conversation.
That'd be great, Melissa, if you wanted to touch on some more points that you didn't get to address.
Sure. I think that mostly what we had talked about sort of in preparing for our talk, between all of our session, is that that in some ways we need to kind of recognize that all of the work that we do, the research that we do, that it can be added to and enhanced, I think, when you include multiple perspectives, and I think that if there's options to have some programming, have some community engagement, bring people in, that if you start there, I mean, Corey is saying that this is 2 generations away from him. It's that's not that, it's so true that these are not that far away from us. They're not that so removed, so bringing people in because it's simply the right thing to do, because it's their relatives, I think can help change the conversation, and also, change kind of how, archaeologists and anthropologists and anyone coming from another, field or perspective, or community and culture, it's going to help you kind of move through it more carefully, and be more inviting in all of your language, So I think that was sort of what we had talked about, is if there was endless funds and endless time, if we can start to, I think, rethink where the process starts as far as research and projects, that maybe if it starts with humans before it starts with digging anything or working on, unearthing anything, that if it starts first with the humans who live there currently, that we might be able to inform each other in ways that we wouldn't even imagine. So.
Monty, you're on mute.
Yep. I was just warned as a Zoom warning. Yeah. But yeah, Melissa, those are all excellent points. And yeah, like I said, as Jake wisely pointed out, a lot of it's time and budget that drive a lot of things. But I will tell you that prehistoric is a long word to type, and you can save your clients a bit of money by shortening it up to ancestral or cultural or even old, as Corey pointed out.
I think there's also kind of this idea too that you know, because it seems difficult that it's sort of maybe an excuse not to try, you know. And I think that if we start to look at kind of all these projects, you know, as non-linear, you know, as relationships, you know, rather than just a momentary sort of job, you know. And I know that everyone here, it's like we're in this session because we care about this or want to learn about it or want to know why people care about it at all. You know, I think that that trying to just kind of like stay within that vein and really think about these projects as relational, because for people like myself and Corey, and you know, I see other people like Angie Wade in the comments, that this is personal for us, you know, and that's it's not just a job. And respecting that is really important.
Absolutely. Anne, I see your hands up. I think I unmuted you.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm almost, in a way, I'm sad that we're even still having to have a conversation about whether prehistoric is an appropriate term to be using in Alaska. You know, for those who say it's difficult to avoid, I don't think I've used the term prehistoric in writing, possibly occasionally talking, because, you know, I'm 65. I went to grad school a long time ago and, you know, was reading archaeology books when I was in like second grade. So, you know, it's kind of in there, but, you know, you don't need to use that term. I mean, history for most people is the history of a people. It's not stuff in a book, and it's not, you know, what a historian thinks of as history or a philosopher thinks of as history. And so most of the people who are reading it do not have that background. So when you're using the word historic and prehistoric, you know, the connotations that come with the word prehistoric for most of the reading audience, particularly maybe for CRM, but even in archaeology, are not ones that I think we want to be perpetuating, and they're not appropriate. You know, I'm also a little puzzled about the site naming thing, because most places have a name. It's amazing how detailed the names on the landscape are. I mean, I have found a site that I couldn't have yet to find a Inupiaq name for. I obviously haven't asked quite the right person. But, you know, and yes, some of them are very difficult to say. I mean, I still can't say right when, you know, we call it burner culture. You know, but I think that should be, you know, difficult though they may be to say and write. I think, you know, you call a place what its name is. Don't make up something. Don't, you know, translating it into English even seems a bit problematic to me. I mean, that wasn't the name of the place. You know, so, you know, but it's really not that hard to avoid prehistoric. And then you can, you know, you can change your language a little bit when you're talking about archaeological cultures to make it clear that you're not conflating the material culture, which is what you can see in a, you know, when you do an excavation or find things on the beach or whatever, versus the culture writ large of a people, you know, because I mean, it's clear that what we call burner culture or Thule culture or late Western Thule culture or Inupiaq culture, which all flow right into each other, are all cultures belonging to the exact same people. You know, they are literally ancestral to each other, and their genetics are, you know, back that up, as well as language and everything else. So, you know, and I'm sure the case is similar elsewhere in the state. So, you know, but you can change your language in ways that make it better. I have a little trouble with ancestral sites, simply because I've worked at several sites where people my age and even younger, you know, use that site, maybe camp there every summer for months, you know, when they were young people. And you know, that's not really an ancestral site. I mean, you know, they do have grandkids, but you know, they're still alive and kicking, right? So, you know, it almost seems a little, I don't know.
Yeah, there's not a lot of easy answers. Like It's
Yeah.
not an absolute win on all of it. Yeah, you're right, Ann.
One thing that that took out of my slide because I didn't want to interject a bunch of other points was that just maybe to leave you guys to think about was like the word elder as well. I know we're talking about, I'm kind of changing the content or the subject matter, but you know, the word, I constantly have to correct people when they use the little e, like when they're referring to an established position in our community. If you're referring to an established position in our community, use a big E. That you're talking about a position that is very highly esteemed. If you're just simply talking about somebody who's older than you, then use a small e. But anytime you're saying that you know, just to clear that one up,
Yeah.
please use the big E when you're referring to any of our established positions in our communities.
So we had a question in here in the chat, and it was how does the word pre-contact work? And or what are folks' thoughts on that? And there again, I lump that kind of in with prehistoric myself, or the even more ambiguous term of proto-historic. Folks were nearby, but not necessarily touching, I guess, or whatever it is. And
History is history. And if you're dealing with whatever people you're dealing with, I don't care if they're Nupiaq or Danish, they have a history that started, way back, long time ago. And it, goes forward until if there's still people there today. And, maybe the people have gone somewhere else. Not so much the case in Alaska, but yeah. I mean, pre-contact is useful when you have an issue where you have to divide stuff, you have for I find the only place I use it is where there's usually comes in some CRM context where there's some reason why people want to know, is it historic or is it not historic, whatever. I really push into, then yes, contact. And often there is a change in the material culture that people had, closely associated with contact, but it's not 100%. It's certainly not the beginning of trade. I mean, for crying out loud, people in Alaska were part of the world trading system, not at high intensity, but a part of the world trading system, clearly before, any Euro-Americans stepped foot in Alaska from either side of the, on the North American continent for that matter, or the South American either. People were getting back and forth across the Bering Strait, and people being people, they were trading. So, that's not just, pretending that somehow when white folks showed up, that's when things is not correct.
I may jump in very quickly. I totally agree with that. And that one doesn't, because we have been having these international trade fairs for thousands of years. Just look at for instance, at Cape Essenberg, that project that found, came across the cast bronze with a little made in China sticker on there from 1,000 years ago. No, but so we've been part of this international trading, like you could walk hundreds of miles, or you can traveling and experiencing travelers has been a part of our culture for a very long time, and trading has at the center of it all. And I think that, yeah.
It's so much about the words that we're using and then the mindset behind them, and we can change the words that we're using, but if we're not changing the mindset, then you kind of fall into the same paths or whatever. I'm thinking about the paper that I wrote really recently about the Cutinut Trade Fair, and I was writing it to want to share the history that is much longer than that. Trade has been here, international relations have been here, travel between places, all of that was super complex and established, but then also talking about it up until now and the changes and stuff. And so in that, I was looking at Melissa's comment about spelling it out like prior to Western contact. Like, what do you mean, not using the shorthand if you're going to describe that as like in your timeline, like spelling it out more? I guess that's one of the things I tried to do, but like, I have no idea how it landed. And I'd be very open to feedback of anyone who read it or is going to go to the presentation tomorrow. But yeah.
Yeah, it seems kind of hard because I think like Jake had put something on like what is contact, that it's kind of just like, why is it sort of like this before and after thing, right? It's just kind of like I was saying, well, maybe it's prior to colonial contact or prior to colonial invasion, it's I think that there's like lots of ways to do it, but really kind of like spelling it out and sort of its plain kind of form as to what happened or what was the effect of that. It's not necessarily like needs to be this sort of like marker of history, because also it begins to continue to divorce us from these ideas. Like I think Gerad said it really beautifully, is that if we're constantly being comparing, indigenous history to Western history, and if you can start to remove that hierarchy or start to give power back to people using your language, right? Using language to talk about, that Monty had talked a lot about and like using an ancestral place, or something like time immemorial, or finding ways to continue to affirm indigenous presence in this way that's much more long term, and I think that I'm not saying it quite right or strong enough, but I think if you can find ways to use your language to equitably recognize the sustainable and enduring history of indigenous people, if that's part of your goals in your writing, because I think that's something that we all know here in this room, then I think that that's a good guiding force, and that can be something that changes and grows, right? Because if we're in this like process of change, then it's going to be ongoing, right?
Absolutely, Melissa. And Christian, I think I unmuted you.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hey, this is Chris Thomas. I'm with over in the Yukon, just off to the east of you all here. But yeah, no, we often kind of struggle with that, and I've been working a lot trying to present archaeology, something like archaeology, to a lot of communities in the Yukon. It's kind of one of the things that struck me quite a few years ago, anyways. You come out of the field and you pull out a bag of artifacts, and you're talking to the history, and you're sitting there presenting to people about sometimes the remains are just rocks and bones and stuff, and your whole storyline is just how old is something. And I think and you say this is history, and and you get a bunch of people blinking at you going, well, really? You're kind of sometimes presenting, if you're just thinking about how old is something and when it happened, is a funny way to relate history back to people with no kind of cultural dressings other than just how old it is. And I think that can sometimes be associated with these terms. And I started thinking, how do I present something at a site that makes sense to people? And what I think some of the things I've seen in the archaeological record over years is often when you're working at a site, the kind of things people were doing at it recently were kind of the same as things people were doing at hundreds of years ago. And sometimes you even see these thousands of years old kind of records of consistency, and people still say, well, how old is it? And I started thinking about, what's, a funny way I've come to explain, like when we're giving tours in our back lab, but how old something is I've got this picture of myself, when I was, at my third birthday, and you got this picture of a little kid. And when I look at that picture, I'd say, I'm how old was I when that picture was taken to me? And people, oh yeah, that makes sense. And then I can look at a picture of myself from Christmas in 1983, and what I see is Christmas, right? Not necessarily 1983. And I think a lot of the sites we work at when we're working at cultural sites should probably be viewed more in that sort of situation, whether it's something in the 1920s or something in 8847 or something like that. It's I think a way of teaching history is making a strong attempt as an archaeologist to associate it with a tradition. And then I think there's been a lot of people that have we worked with, that's how they teach sites. This site is about salmon fishing in the summer, this site is about caribou hunting in the fall, this site is about ice fishing in the winter. And it's that kind of cultural nuance that we lose when we aren't mindful of the words, and sometimes even the paragraphs and the pages in the books, we lose track of it by kind of trying to find the simple nuance and things. But anyway, that's my thought. And we just went through this process of trying to do a World Heritage nomination of the Klondike Gold Rush, sites associated with the Klondike Gold Rush, and sites that showed the impact to or the experience of First Nations people in the Yukon with the Klondike Gold Rush. And it was it was a challenging thing to kind of deal with. Almost all the sites are sites that people lived at for a very long time, but you're trying to determine the experience of a 36-year period at the very transition of this colonial era, this different economic regime. And using we had to use, you can't just pick one word or the other. There's nuance in how you use things, because there's pre-colonial, post-colonial, things that are archaeological, things that are standing structures, things that get represented through different cultural nuance. And sometimes, it's not about a word, it's about drawing together an entire cultural tapestry to explain concepts. So it's a tough one. Anyway, complicated. That's my thought anyway.
No, you're right. It is a tough one and a lot of different aspects to it. Let's see. There we go. I think I got you unmuted.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe first a fun fact. One of the courses that Igor teaches here at UAF is Inuit art. And that when he first started teaching this course, I think in the first semester that it was offered, it was listed in the catalog as Eskimo art. And it took almost a year and 12 signatures through the process the university uses for course changes, so the course leave, to get that word, to get the title of the course changed. And I'm just sharing that by the way of sympathy and admiration to the many of you who are trying to challenge the languages and the term of words that are so established and ubiquitous, taken for granted, and really, just at the very fabric of the field speak, of the work speak that is inherent in our field and in your individual work. I was almost thinking, Gerad, when you were talking about stages of grief, to add maybe stages of paperwork once you hit acceptance. Expanded list. But something that I want to maybe pose as a question, or just really turning to everyone here for help to help me advance with something that I struggle with while using most my presentation time to talk about the just the ever expanding vocabulary that is connected with our work on the cuisines of the Bering Strait. It is the place name for the region that I have not been able to get away with, although I'm always trying. Even in the formal title of the presentation, I called it the cuisines of Chukotka and the neighboring Alaska. Not that those place names should not be question. But even while listening to Anne speak and acknowledging the depth of history at which people have been have been connected across the region or across, the body of water, you still said people were hopping back and forth across the Bering Strait. And of course, when we're talking about that depth of history, they weren't it wasn't the Bering Strait that they were hopping over. And while it seems that other regions kind of have had, a better time with advancing in that, like the vocabulary of just really like naming the region that their life's work is connected to, I have not been able to get past the Bering Strait, even though to me it really makes sense that I do. Sometimes I try to just list all of the names of the communities in Chukotka in Alaska, but then inevitably it just leads to those are the Chukotkan and Alaskan sides of the Bering Strait, and so on. I mean, I also just say the Yupik, Chukchi, and Inupiaq regions of the region where we work, but then I cannot, ground it to that area, to those coastal regions, but, and be specific enough to, at least with respect to both like Chukchi and Inupiaq communities that are that just have a much greater regional presence than the communities that are right there in that area of the Bering Strait. And so I'm just sharing this as using the session to maybe get some good feedback on this now, or just by correspondence if we can get reconnected. Thank you.
Yeah, that's all good. Anybody else got any points they'd like to bring up? If not, we'll kind of wrap this up. There is a ongoing workshop right now. It started about 12 minutes ago on National Science Foundation funding for those interested in that.
Thank you to the fellow presenters. This really has gotten me thinking a lot, and I think every single presentation was very fit very well. And thank you, Monty, for helping put this together, and the Alaska Anthropological Association, and to all of our awesome people in the room who have been doing such great work, really, and for paving the way, and so that we could hopefully make more of these changes. Koyana.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, everyone. I think, yeah, we continue to trudge along and down our anthropological paths, and hopefully we can continue to work to refine things a bit and keep moving forward. And with that, I'll just say thank you to everyone. And I once again apologize for not recording the first half of the session. We got the last two presenters and this dialogue, so that is at least something. But yeah, and also all you presenters, you can relax now because we get the rest of the conference and you don't have to present anymore. It's all done. And so everyone else, enjoy the rest of the conference, and I will see you on the Zoom screen tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.